Starting about 1:05. Maybe give some time for people to filter in.
Sure, the live stream has started, but we can wait a few minutes.
Okay. All right. Okay. Well, welcome everybody tuning in live out there on YouTube. We will start momentarily. We appreciate all of our distinguished guests tuning in online and those who are here in person at the South Cumberland Branch Library on the south end of the historic Queen City of Cumberland. Okay. Oh, good. Okay. I see we're live. Wonderful. All right. Just to fill the airtime until we start here, just like I said, it's for those of you who are tuning in live on YouTube. It is snowing outside. It's a little blustery, so we're just going to wait a moment or two for some people to filter in. But we'd like to give a special thanks to the Downtown Cumberland Business Association, Miss Allie Klein of the Allegany County Public Library, who is on the ones and twos handling the live stream. Al Feldstein, who I'm sure some folks here know very well. Western Maryland's Historical Library, Cumberland Times News, West Virginia Public Broadcasting, Western Maryland History, which is a Facebook group, the Library of Congress, Frostburg State University, and especially Dr. Anthony Crosby, who is here in person in attendance. Sydney, DC Super Sid Thomas, who writes for the Allegany magazine and is a presence here in Cumberland. His family lives on Green Street, or has a home on Green Street, just a couple houses towards downtown from the Jane Gates House. Denise Tazzy Moore, the McNeil family, Sean Bell, Bishop Bronson, and Charmaine, Chad Dean, Chateau de Fairfix, and Crick Diggers, who are the gentlemen who dig in like privies and find historic bottles. Cool. And also we'd like to thank the Honorable Sherry Schneider in the back, known as Sojourner Truth. I met her almost 10 years ago when there was a Frederick Douglass role-playing game at, I guess it was through Frostburg State University. And Sherry portrayed Sojourner Truth, and they gave me the very difficult task of portraying Frederick Douglass. Okay. All right. Well, Justin, what do you want to start? I guess we'll get one more minute and then we will start, everybody. I guess the weather, we're expecting a sold out capacity crowd. We have a couple open seats here. If anybody's tuning in live on YouTube and would like to head on down or walk around the corner to the library, we have a couple available seats. So we will do introductions. I will introduce my colleague here to my right and to your left. This is Justin McNeil. He's the honorable father of three. He's an IT professional who has serviced businesses throughout the Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Western Maryland area. Justin and I have worked for many years together. We used to be involved in kind of community arts projects. We have now shifted our focus to community history. Mr. McNeil has had essays in the Washington Informer. He has been featured on radio and television in the Washington, D.C., Baltimore area. And he attended Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia, which some will know that's where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. attended. Now I'm going to ask Justin to introduce me.
Okay. Well, first of all, good afternoon, everybody. To my left is John Muller, my dear friend, author of Frederick Douglass in D.C., The Lion of Anacostia. His book is for sale wherever good books are sold. Maybe one here in the library. And
you can get it. I don't know if it's still Marina in the Maryland Public Library System, but you can find this book in the Marina Library System throughout Maryland.
Well, and he's also the author of Mark Twain in D.C., The Adventures of a Capital Correspondent. He has presented widely throughout the D.C. Baltimore metropolitan area at venues including the Library of Congress, Enoch Pratt Library, D.C. Public Library, Frederick Douglass Natural Historic Sites, and local universities. Muller's a frequent guest on local D.C. radio stations, Has been cited numerous times by the Washington Post, Washington City Paper, Cumberland Times, a bunch of other local history research and subject matter experts, and there's a few rather well-known authors who have yet to credit my good friend, but I know where they got the information from. I'm not going to name names. He's been featured on C-SPAN's Book TV, C-SPAN's American History TV, broadcast airways on NBC, Hagerstown, WPFW in DC, WMAU, a bunch of others, the Del Mar Public Radio. For the past decade, Muller has contributed to hundreds of articles to local and national print and online news sources, including the Washington Informer. In 2019, John presented the history of Frederick Douglass throughout Western Maryland, including Washington County, including the Washington County Free Library and Frostburg State University. And that is a little bit about who we are.
Wonderful. Thank you for the kind introduction, Justin. Okay, so we have about 54 slides or so. We will try to wrap a little after 2 o'clock. We will gladly take any questions, comments, critiques, observations, stories, anecdotes that good folks would like to share. So I presented, just a real quick background is, as Professor Schneider knows in the back, in 2013, I had the opportunity to participate in a Frederick Douglass role-playing game that was at Frostburg State University. And before driving up to the hotel in LaVale, I did a quick little Google search or newspaper.com search and found that Frederick Douglass had visited Cumberland in September of 1879, and it was reported in the Washington Post and Baltimore Sun. And really, the bicentennial of Frederick Douglass in 2018, which commemorated and memorialized his 200th birthday. He was born in 1818. I began to canvass the entire state of Maryland, West Virginia, Eastern Shore, about the local history of Frederick Douglass, and that kind of started to expand the areas in which I presented. I had the opportunity to present at Frostburg State University in April 2019. And this is a much improved, much updated presentation on Douglass in Cumberland and Allegany County. And a lot of the information Justin and I are going to share with you today is kind of the local history context and the ecosystem here in Cumberland and Allegany County, which supported Frederick Douglass's visits and his many associations and overlapping connections with Cumberland. All right, to get right into the first slide. Frederick Douglass in Allegany County. On 2 separate occasions, Frederick Douglass visited Allegany County in Maryland's Western Panhandle, the mountains south, central Appalachia. Speaking in Cumberland in 1879 and Frostburg in 1882, Douglass was deliberate in traveling to the western communities of his native state. Active as a high-profile surrogate for Maryland's Republican Party, the barnstorming of U.S. Marshal Douglass throughout the state was a dual effort to support the party in that year's gubernatorial election and the pending midterm elections of 1880. Marshal Douglass's canvass of Maryland's 6th Congressional District included a visit to Frederick City in early April 1879, in company with Lewis Henry Steiner, who was the founding librarian of Enoch Pratt Library in Baltimore. Douglass visited Hagerstown in late April 1879, where he was introduced by future U.S. Congressman and future U.S. Senator Louis McComas at the Washington County Courthouse that still stands today. And Douglass visited Cumberland in September 1879, where he shared company with an integrated delegation, including former United States Congressman and future Maryland Governor Lloyd Lowndes, as well as a local African Methodist Episcopal pastor and prominent local and statewide officials. In March of 1882, Douglass returned to Allegany County, visiting the town of Frostburg nearly 2 decades before the founding of present-day Frostburg State University. There is evidence to support that the visit of Douglass to Frostburg was initiated by students at Storer College in Harpers Ferry, West Virginia, from Frostburg. While Douglass is historically associated with the Eastern Shore, Baltimore, and Washington, D.C., the series of visits Frederick Douglass made to Appalachian Maryland and the region, we contend, must be properly recognized and included in the more complete narrative of Douglass that is promoted, marketed, and taught within the state. The visits of Douglass to Allegany County were not isolated jaunts and are not now obscure pieces of Douglassonian trivia, but important illustrative examples of the political and community activism Douglass sustained following the Civil War throughout Maryland. We will discuss Douglass and local railroads, local education, local churches, Emancipation Day celebrations, the Queen City Hotel, and much, much more. All right. Just in the interest of time, I won't go into great detail about these visits, but in 1879, Douglass visits and speaks in Frederick, Hagerstown, Cumberland. In 1879, he also spoke in Martinsburg, which is a little down the way in Berkeley County, West Virginia. So he's very active in 1879 in Maryland's 6th Congressional District. That was a governor. There was a gubernatorial election that year. And also 1879 is when there was what was known as the Exoduster movement, which was, this is about a half century before the Great Migration, where basically Black folks from the rural South were moving from the South to northern cities like Chicago. And Douglass was someone who took the position that Black Americans should stay in their communities. And so Douglass is traveling throughout Western Maryland. He's essentially speaking in the support of Black Americans to stay in their communities and stay in these areas of kind of the mountain south of Maryland. And he shared the stage with many prominent, interesting officials that some who study local Maryland history closely will know some of these names. And we'll get a little bit more into detail some of these names later in the presentation. And many of the buildings in which Douglass spoke in or was connected to have been preserved and are still extant in these communities. All right, this is just a nice historic picture of Bedford Street from Cumberland, and it kind of captures the street scene. There's two young little fellows walking across the street. There's another fellow running across the street, and then as you can see on your right-hand side, it appears to be an older gentleman just kind of sitting there observing what is going on.
He has a little hat on, maybe in some official capacity there. I don't know. That's a nice picture, though.
All right, the next slide. Where is Frederick Douglass in these photos? If anybody knows, you can shout it out. Okay. The estate of this distinguished founding father is on the Potomac River, downstream from Cumberland, Maryland, south of the terminus of the C&O Canal. Over 96 million people have visited this site since 1860, when the estate officially opened to the public. Today, the historic site sees an average of 1 million visitors a year.
Anybody?
Bronson, you should know this. He's on the $1 bill. Okay.
It says GW's estate at Mount Vernon.
Yeah. So this is George Washington's estate of Mount Vernon, and going backwards, Allie, if you can.
That's
I don't know if I can.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. Right there.
Okay. Well, in this slide we had the
No.
It's okay. All right. Well, the slides where we had the arrows, they were pointing to Frederick Douglass, and the next slide is Fort Cumberland, which our friends from Cumberland know its historical connections and associations as being the headquarters for George Washington during the French and Indian War. All right. Could Frederick Douglass have visited Washington's headquarters during his visit to Cumberland? Growing up on Maryland's Eastern Shore among Black American veterans of the Continental Army who had served within the ranks of General Washington's trusted officer corps, Frederick Douglass had a lifelong admiration for George Washington. This was expressed in references Douglass made to Washington in his abolitionist speeches and several visits Douglass made to Mount Vernon. Due to this apparent affinity for Washington, is it possible that Douglass visited Washington's headquarters during his stay in Cumberland? We think it is possible and even likely. You want to add any comments, Justin?
Yeah, I don't know. When John first told me about this affinity that Douglass had for Washington, I was a little bit skeptical. I thought maybe he just used Washington's words as a way, for the abolitionist cause. So there's several times where Washington would bring up speeches where, he would say that essentially, he did not agree with slavery, and it was, even though it was a way of life here, it was not what maybe God intended for people to, maybe practice or whatever. In going there, I find that they do kind of have a slight representation of Douglass at Mount Vernon. There could be a lot more there to be done. And I don't know how many people here have ever been to Mount Vernon, but I know for me personally, going there, it was a bit of experience. They have a site there that honors the enslaved community that lived there. It's actually interesting because there's an enslaved and freed members of the community at Mount Vernon. And when you kind of think about the community of Mount Vernon, the number of Black folks, I guess it'd be like a 20-to-1 ratio of Black to white there sometimes. So when I was at Mount Vernon, I was kind of like under the impression that this is almost like a Black village that George Washington's house kind of sits atop of, right? And even the workers there, and this is kind of a funny thing, when we went to go see the blacksmith, all the blacksmiths that were working there were white guys. And then, this is funny. I don't know, John, I can tell these people that, right?
Go ahead.
So we were there, and then John just kind of, after we go in there and we see the slave museum, John kind of just remarks to them like, why aren't you guys Black? And I thought that was hilarious, because most of the people that were working the grounds would have been Black. The blacksmiths would have been Black. The people driving dairies and all the horses and stuff would have been Black. I thought that was funny.
The archival documented record demonstrates that the skilled tradesmen at Mount Vernon, the carpenters, the masons, the blacksmiths, were Black Americans. And Douglass he would use Washington in his abolitionist speeches to essentially say that the record demonstrates that Washington was an emancipationist,
Mm-hmm.
and he had abolitionist tendencies, and that the pro-slavery force in Congress doesn't want to admit and acknowledge that Washington, on his deathbed, he manumitted Billy Lee, who are familiar with famous paintings of the Washington family. There was a Black gentleman kind of off to the side. That is, Billy Lee was one of Washington's most trusted kind of aide-de-camps. He would give him a shave, he'd cut his hair, they rode together. And so when Washington dies, he manumitted Billy Lee, and some are probably familiar that he put in his will that when Martha Washington passed away, that the slaves that he had owned would then be free. So Douglass was very deliberate in using that part of Washington's history to support his argument in favor of abolition. All right. Cumberland's Sumner Cemetery and Frederick Douglass. I left our tombstones of 6 veterans of the Union Army's United States Colored Troops who served during the Civil War and are buried in Cumberland Sumner Cemetery. On Memorial Day, May 27, 1991, the Cumberland Historic Cemetery Organization unveiled a monument to the memory of these 6 soldiers. The names of these men, all of whom belong to the 30th Regiment Infantry, U.S. Colored Troops organized at Camp Stanton, which is kind of down southern Maryland, are as follows: Francis Taylor, Thomas Lindsay, Abraham Gregg, Thomas Simpson, Sam Perry, Hannibal Kinner. And this photo is courtesy of Al Feldstein, we found in Western Maryland's Historic Library. Sumner Cemetery, founded in the 1880s by the Laboring Sons, a Black American community organization founded before the Civil War, takes its namesake from radical Republican United States Senator from Massachusetts, Charles Sumner. In 1875, Frederick Douglass served as a pallbearer for Sumner. During his 1879 visit to Cumberland, the Laboring Sons of Cumberland were prominent in the proceedings of the Emancipation Day Parade. Established as the first Black cemetery in Allegany County, an older sister cemetery in Frederick City, Maryland, was founded in the 1850s by the Laboring Sons. In recent years, there have been efforts to restore and preserve the Laboring Sons Cemetery in Frederick, as well as here in Cumberland with Sumner Cemetery. On June 21st, 1977, Sumner Cemetery was placed on the National Register of Historic Places. It's just an open-ended question. How many residents of Sumner Cemetery may have seen Frederick Douglass speak in Allegany County or adjacent communities? All right, now these are some friends and associates of Frederick Douglass with connections to Cumberland. Bishop Alexander Walker Wayman, who we will get into detail in just a moment. He was the 7th bishop of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. He helped to lay cornerstones at churches in Allegany County and was a frequent presence in Cumberland. John Robert Clifford, who is this great grand uncle of Henry Louis Gates, I believe Mr. Clifford was the nephew of Jane Gates. I may have that a little incorrect, but Clifford and Jane Gates had family kinship connections. Mr. Clifford was born in Hardy County, present-day Hardy County, West Virginia. He went to Storer College. He started a newspaper in Martinsburg, West Virginia. He was the first Black lawyer admitted to the bar and practice in West Virginia. Mm-hmm. He was friends with a gentleman named Judge Hoke, who lived right across the Potomac River in Mineral County in Kaiser, West Virginia. And Mr. Clifford was the first Black attorney to practice here in Allegany County. Mr. Reverend Matthew Traverse, who I couldn't find when he passed away, but he was the pastor at Metropolitan African Methodist Episcopal Church at Frederick and Decatur Street when the second story addition was added. And Mr. Traverse was born in Baltimore in 1855 and was educated at the Douglass Institute in Baltimore, which you can guess was named for Frederick Douglass. And Mr. Douglass knew Reverend Traverse when he was an adolescent. All right, some other associates of Frederick Douglass with connections to Cumberland. Josiah Henson, who some may know is the real-life inspiration for Uncle Tom's Cabin. In 1825, when he takes the wagon from kind of down near Montgomery County area all the way out to Kentucky, he travels on the National Road and passes right through Cumberland. Reverend John Baptiste Snowden was based in Westminster, and by his account would walk on foot from Westminster to Mount Savage. So he would walk all the way from Westminster out here to Cumberland to basically serve Black churches in Allegany County. This is before the Civil War. Some may know this gentleman to your far right, Rutherford B. Hayes. All right, he was the only. I like Rutherford B. Hayes. He had Presidential Museum and Library in Fremont, Ohio. I think he kind of gets a little bit of a bad rap in history, but some may disagree with that. But nonetheless, Rutherford B. Hayes was the only American president who served in the Union Army who was wounded in battle. He was wounded at the Battle of South Mountain, which kind of overlaps Frederick and Washington counties. Some who are familiar with your Civil War history will know that future President Hayes was actually stationed here in Cumberland, I believe in 1865, and he writes vividly in his diary about kind of the atmosphere of Cumberland during the Civil War. And President Hayes was elected in 1876. He's the 19th president, and some may know he addressed the Cumberland Fair in 1878. So dare I speculate, if I'm allowed to, Mr. McNeil, I speculate that possibly Mr. Hayes was an additional voice in the ear of Frederick Douglass saying, oh yeah, I just came back from Cumberland. There were wonderful folks out there. I was treated with great hospitality. I believe he stayed at the Brunswick Hotel, which I believe was raised a couple years ago. But nonetheless, President Hayes could have advocated for Douglass to visit Cumberland. And after Douglass visited Cumberland and he saw President Hayes, oh yeah, you were right about your recommendation to visit Cumberland. I had a great time. Okay.
The colored people of Cumberland were fine people, something like that.
That's comfortable.
Okay. That's what they would have said back then. That's okay. Language evolved over time. All right. Okay. So other political leaders with connections to Cumberland and Frederick Douglass: John Lewis Thomas Jr. For deep dive scholars of Cumberland history will know that this gentleman grew up in Cumberland. He was a practicing attorney before the Civil War. He was a radical unionist. He was a radical Republican, and he was an advocate for civil rights and freedmen's rights. And he was very, very close to Frederick Douglass. And for those of you who closely read Douglass's autobiographical writings, when Douglass visits White House in 1881, he visits White House with Mr. John Lewis Thomas, who at that time was involved with the Customs House in Baltimore. Lloyd Lowndes Jr., which we will get into greater detail in a couple moments. Mr. Lowndes was a congressman in the early 1870s. I have reason to believe that Mr. Lowndes actually visited Frederick Douglass at his home in Capitol Hill and possibly had dinner or like a brunch, or they actually sat down and talked. Douglass knew members of the Lloyd family and the Lowndes family from the Eastern Shore, which I'll get into detail in some future slides. Mr. Lewis McComas, who was based more so out of kind of Hagerstown or Washington County, but he was the congressman for several terms of the 6th District and was a frequent presence in Oakland, Frostburg, Cumberland, and was very active in state Republican Party politics. And Mr. McComas introduced Frederick Douglass when he spoke in Hagerstown. McComas was the secretary of the Republican National Convention in 1892, which was held in Minnesota, which was the last Republican National Convention that Mr. Douglass attended. And McComas helped young Black students at Howard University through the recommendation of Frederick Douglass get patronage positions. All right, Bishop Alexander Walker Wayman. I think I'll pass this off to my friend Mr. McNeil to read if you'd like to.
Sure. Bishop Alexander Walker Wayman. Okay, born free 1821 in Carroll County on Maryland's Eastern Shore. Bishop Wayman's parents were friendly with the parents of Anna Murray, the wife of Frederick Douglass, who babysat a young Bishop Wayman. Leaving the shore for Baltimore in the early 1840s, Wayman became involved with the growing African Methodist Episcopal Church, formerly founded in 1816 in Philadelphia by Richard Allen. Bishop Wayman was a regular presence in communities of Western Maryland, helping to establish and grow the AME Church in new communities following the Civil War. He traveled extensively on the railroads and stagecoach lines. In Wayman's 1881 reminiscences, he mentions visiting Cumberland and Allegany County on several occasions, including dedicating an AME church in Frostburg on January 1, 1871. Both annual and seasonal meetings of the Baltimore Conference of the AME Church and Washington Conference of the Methodist Episcopal Church frequently brought Black Methodists to Cumberland. In 1895, at Metropolitan AME in Washington, at Metropolitan AME Church, Washington, D.C., Bishop Wayman eulogized his friend of nearly half a century. Speaking of Mr. Douglass, he would pass that later that year in December.
So Reverend Wayman was a very prominent official of the AME Church. There is an AME church or chapel in Wheeling, West Virginia, named for him. There's a Wayman Church in Frederick County. And Bishop Wayman was on the road probably 300 somewhat days of the year and was really active in helping the AME Church expand westward as well as in the South following the Civil War. All right, so this is Metropolitan African Methodist Episcopal Church at Frederick and Decatur Streets. That's the cornerstone, has the founding as 1837, so that's almost 3 decades before the Civil War. And the second story was built in 1892. Reverend Traverse, who I showed a picture of earlier, helped to, I don't know, this gentleman at the door. Come on in, come on in. Welcome, come on in. We're having a history discussion. All right, excellent.
I believe the first story was built in 1883. And then I think Traverse is around for the latter part where they built the second story. They said that they laid the cornerstone and they put a silver spoon in, I guess maybe with the cement, and laid the cornerstone there in 1883.
Yeah, I don't. We didn't have time to kind of get deep into the architectural record of Metropolitan AME, but you can kind of even see just looking at that the church has probably been modified and/or essentially improved over the years. There are many AME churches throughout Maryland that there was like a first story built, a second story added, maybe even was at one time and then this was added another time. And so basically the churches have been modified over the years. And sometimes it is a little difficult to kind of figure out when certain additions were made. The 1837 founding is when the Metropolitan, or it was actually founded as a Bethel church. Bethel, there's a Bethel AME church founded in Philadelphia. Then Baltimore, there's a Bethel church in Eastern Maryland. Quinn Chapel in Frederick was originally Bethel. Ebenezer AME church in Hagerstown was originally Bethel, and Metropolitan AME was originally Bethel. And interestingly enough, Douglass was, as Mr. McNeil just said, Douglass was eulogized at Metropolitan African Methodist Episcopal Church in Washington, D.C., which is on M Street, right around the corner from the White House. So yeah, so you can see basically like the way that it's built now, it's the updates are essentially blended, so it looks like was maybe built at one time, but it's been modified over the years. And so 1837 is when the Baltimore Conference of the African Methodist Episcopal Church recognized the chapter in Cumberland, and the first church would have been most likely a wood frame church, which a lot of the early precursors of the AME churches were wood frame churches. And then as the community gathered capital and was able to do fundraising, you'll see that AME churches are usually brick, just like today with the manual Episcopal up on Washington Street. Usually Episcopal churches, for example, are stone. All right. So Metropolitan AME, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, formerly established in Philadelphia in 1816, was an outgrowth of the Methodist Episcopal Church, and it's established its. So the Richard Allen in 1816 breaks from the Methodist Episcopal Church and founds the AME Church, which is essentially an entirely separate denomination, has a separate form of governance. The AME congregations were established in Baltimore City and then moved, for this presentation, mostly westward, going from Frederick to Hagerstown, Cumberland, Frostburg. Some may know there was an AME church at a time in Oakland, Maryland. And for those of you who kind of follow the news, I believe there's an effort to relocate the former Bethel AME Church in Oakland from like a farm to somewhere in Oakland. Some may know more about that than I do, but that's been in the news the past like 6 months or a year. So AME congregations were established throughout Western Maryland. Many of these churches remain today. Addresses by U.S. Marshal Frederick Douglass in Frederick and Hagerstown in 1879 directly benefited the local AME churches. And here in Cumberland, the pastor of the AME church was part of Mr. Douglass's entourage. All right, and kind of interesting, or setting the stage for Douglass's visit here to Cumberland, as well as the AME church, was his relationship with Governor Lloyd Lowndes, which predated his visit here to Cumberland. Lloyd Lowndes was born February 21st, 1845 in Clarksburg, what is presently West Virginia, after his father had relocated to Cumberland. Mr. Lowndes died in 1905, and he's buried in Rose Hill Cemetery. As a Republican, Lowndes represented Maryland's 6th Congressional District in the U.S. House of Representatives from 1873 to 1875. At that time, he was the youngest congressman, and he later served as governor from 1896 to 1900. He had 6 children with his wife, Elizabeth Tasker Lowndes. The Lowndes home on Washington Street was visited by President Benjamin Harrison in 1889. This is a photo of the former home of Governor Lowndes on Washington Street. And President Harrison appointed Frederick Douglass to Haiti, and he visited Mr. Lowndes in 1889 when I believe it was the centennial celebration of Allegany County's founding. And we don't have a record of their dinner conversation. I know that Mr. Lowndes' wife, I believe, famously kind of got like President Harrison to smile. I guess he was kind of usually a curmudgeon sort of character. Somebody know more than I do. But it's possible that their friendship or relationship with Frederick Douglass came up, where Mr. Lowndes said, "Hey, how have you seen Mr. Douglass recently?" Or Harrison said, "Oh, have you been in touch with Mr. Douglass recently?" Mr. Harrison appointed Frederick Douglass as ambassador to Haiti, and Douglass had served on President Harrison's inaugural committee. Lowndes' daughter, Elizabeth Lowndes, died in 1963 and willed the Washington Street property for educational purposes to the Allegany County Library. And the Cumberland branch, or the main Cumberland branch, is up on Washington Street across from the county courthouse. Both Lloyd and Lowndes family members are buried at the cemetery at White House in Talbot County, and the Lloyd and Lowndes families are specifically mentioned in Douglass's autobiographical writings. Lloyd Lowndes' grandmother was Eleanor Lloyd Lowndes, who was the daughter of Edward Lloyd V, whom Frederick Douglass writes about in great detail in his autobiographical writings. And Douglass was kind of the executive assistant or aide-de-camp or body servant, if it were, to Daniel Lloyd, who is the Lloyd Lowndes' grandmother's younger brother. So essentially, the Lloyd Lowndes is interconnected on both sides with families that Frederick Douglass knew from the White House, and he talks about knowing who these essentially kind kind of the ruling families of Maryland were during the 1800s. There are, I believe, 4 members of the Lloyd family who were governor. Lloyd Lowndes had Henry Lloyd, who was the youngest son of Daniel Lloyd. He was out of Cambridge, Maryland. Henry Lloyd was governor in the 1880s. And I don't know kind of how to distinguish the relationship between Lloyd Lowndes and Henry Lloyd, but they were essentially cousins. All right. And what's interesting is that Lloyd Lowndes was the only Republican member of the Lloyd family in terms of, at that time, the Republican family was more oriented towards supporting civil rights and freedmen's rights and black voter rights in Maryland. All right. So just real quickly, because this is more towards Hagerstown. I've learned over the years doing these presentations that sometimes there might not be as much overlap as I try to think there is with history, but okay, so we're going to try to stick to Cumberland, but nonetheless, this gentleman spent a lot of time in Cumberland because he was the congressman, essentially like David Trone. Although David Trone lives in Potomac, Maryland, he represents Cumberland. I know he tries to be very active with constituent services. So anyway, Mr. McComas was active throughout Allegany County, Garrett County when he was a congressman. He introduced Frederick Douglass in Hagerstown in 1879. He was a United States Senator. He's buried at Rose Hill Cemetery in Hagerstown. And interestingly enough, he was the grandfather of Catherine Edgar Byron, who some may know was the first woman elected to Congress from Maryland. I believe she served in maybe the 40s. Some may know a little bit more than I do. But to the right is the Republican ticket for the 6th Congressional District, of which we currently sit. And this is from the collection of Mr. Al Feldstein. And you'll see that it's supporting Benjamin Harrison for president. And you have Mr. Louis McComas on the bottom, Louis E. McComas, the 6th Congressional District.
I think Catherine Byron also had a son that represented the 6th District too. Goodloe Byron.
Are they related to Beverly Byron and her husband? Her
I'm not sure
husband,
about that.
I think she took over after he died.
Oh yeah, that's right. When he passed away in office.
I think she
his
lives in
wife-
Frederick. She lives in Frederick right
I'm
now.
not sure.
Yeah,
She lived in Frederick.
I forget her husband's name. I can't remember it.
So that and that family was essentially, there's interconnections with Louis McComas, and that's we're kind of throwing a lot of stuff out at you. Some of it making
The connections are infinite.
Yeah, and it just kind of shows the ecosystem of these gentlemen. Frederick Douglass was kind of in their ears advocating for, make sure you look out for like black constituents, make sure you look out for black voters, black Marylanders. You know, the black voting bloc has helped to get you elected. Those sorts of things. All right. So, okay, this is a little discursive inside baseball history, but that's what we're here for. All right, so this is in 1874. Frederick Douglass writes a letter in support of Lloyd Lowndes' 1874 re-election campaign for Maryland's 6th District. Now, I guess I'll just read here. Another candidate, this is from a newspaper in 1874. The Fred Douglass Club of Allegany County has requested Mr. James H. Montgomery, a colored man, to be an independent candidate for Congress in this district, the 6th District, and he has consented. The correspondence, as published in the Cumberland Times, alleges dissatisfaction of the colored voters at the opposition to the Civil Rights Bill by Mr. Lowndes, the Republican nominee, that he is not thoroughly a Republican, that if he should be elected, he could urge in Congress the fact that he was openly opposed to the Civil Rights Bill and was supported by colored voters in spite of that opposition as sufficient proof that the colored people do not desire the passage of the bill. The Times says of the new candidate that, quote, he is above the average in education and intelligence and a man of quite an unobtrusive manners. All right, so Mr. Douglass did not like that his name was being used to essentially support an oppositional candidate to Mr. Lowndes, because Douglass felt that if the Republican Party ticket was splintered and or if the black vote within the Republican Party was split, that it would ensure the defeat of Lloyd Lowndes and therefore ensure that a Democrat would win re-election. And Maryland has very interesting post-Civil War politics where the Maryland's 6th Congressional District was the most consistently Republican. Following the Civil War, the 4th District, which was kind of more southern Maryland, went back and forth between Democrat and Republican. But I believe that Douglass was very active in the 6th Congressional District because of its more union tendencies or more reliable Republican voting bloc. And so this caused a little bit of a controversy. And here's another item. It says the Democratic papers of Western Maryland have demonstrated their sacred regard for the truth by asserting that Frederick Douglass was opposing the election of Honorable Lloyd Lowndes. Frederick Douglass addressed a letter to the editor of the Cumberland News in which he asserts that he is, quote, decidedly and emphatically in favor of the election of Mr. Lowndes and should vote for him if Douglass lived in that district. All right, and here is that letter. Now, I don't know the whole history of when Douglass visited Cumberland in 1879, I believe there were 3 daily papers, maybe even 4 daily papers. And there had the Frostburg Mining Journal, and there was, just with basically every community in the country at that time, there was no Instagram, no Twitter, no Facebook, so there were no radio, no cable news, television. So the newspapers were the way folks got their news. The Baltimore Sun had a Cumberland letter writer and Cumberland correspondent. So yes, so I don't know the history of when the Cumberland News and Cumberland Times kind of merged, but the Cumberland News, which Frederick Douglass is writing directly to their editor, was kind of an ancestor of the present day Cumberland Times News. All right, so Mr. Douglass writes October 27, 1874, to the editor of the Cumberland News, sir, I regret to learn that in regard to, illegible here, but basically my name is being used against Mr. Lowndes, Republican candidate for Congress, on the ground that he voted against taking up the Civil Rights Bill at a particular time and under peculiar circumstances. Unwilling that any act or influence of mine should be exerted against a Republican candidate and therefore in favor of a Democratic candidate, I beg to state to my friends in the 6th District that I am decidedly and emphatically in favor of the election of Mr. Lowndes and should vote for him if I lived in the district and had a vote to give. All right, and Mr. Lowndes did in fact lose that election. William Walsh was elected. He served 2 terms. I believe one of his grandchildren was involved in like a hostage situation in like the 60s or 70s. Some may know a little bit more about that, but that's come up in previous presentations. Anyway, okay. So with the passage of the 15th Amendment in May 1870, the first generation of Black Americans enter the U.S. Congress and become representatives and senators. Of the 21 Black congressmen who served from 1870 to 1901, Maryland was not represented. Many in-state and out-of-state leaders encouraged Douglass to represent Maryland, including friends, family, and politicians. Douglass actively supported the state Republican Party, and Maryland's 6th District was a battleground to a certain extent. And Douglass, like I said, was very active in this district. The culmination of state Republican Party efforts and discontent with Democratic politics, as exemplified by the Gorman Ring, was the election of Governor Lowndes in 1895. Governor Lowndes was the only Republican governor in Maryland in the 19th century, and I believe presently he's still the only Maryland governor from Allegany County. And these are just 2 little interesting items. The left is a letter from a Black voter from the 6th Congressional District, and back in the 1870s, the 6th Congressional District, well, I guess even today, reaches down to Montgomery County. And here's a little interesting note. This is from 1875. The Cumberland Times News reports that the first time in the history of this state, a colored man has been regularly drawn and summoned to serve on a jury of a state court. Judge Pear yesterday drew the juries for the next term of the Circuit Court for Garrett County, and among the number appears a colored man of the name Davis. The first name of this new juror we did not learn, but we understand he's employee of the Mr. Johnson of Johnson's District, Garrett County, and is the only colored man in that section. Judge Pear, who reviewed the summons, was part of Douglass's entourage when he visited Cumberland. All right. So when Douglass visits Cumberland, he is serving as the United States Marshal of the district. And this is an interesting little item from 1877, where it says an ex-constable was in the criminal court in Washington on business the other day and was asked by one of the bailiffs if he was looking for Marshal Douglass. No, sir, was the reply. Not now, but there was a time when he was a fugitive slave when I tried hard to find him. So this could be a true story, it could be an apocryphal story, but it's interesting nonetheless. All right, so how does Douglass arrive to Cumberland? He does not take a Greyhound bus or an Uber. He takes the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. This is a train schedule actually out of Wheeling, but it shows the trains arriving in Grafton, Cumberland, Washington City, Philadelphia, kind of the schedules. Here are a couple of different train stations within this Baltimore, West Virginia. All right, when Douglass would take the Baltimore Ohio Railroad out to Western Maryland, he would disembark from the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Depot in Washington, D.C. This is now kind of presently New Jersey Avenue. And this train station is where President Garfield was assassinated inside this train station. All right, the Queen City Station Hotel. By a show of hands, does anybody remember having a meal or staying at the Queen City Hotel? Dr. Crosby, okay, another gentleman. Wonderful, wonderful. The Queen City Hotel, as some may know better than I, was built in 1871 by the B&O Railroad, and they opened a 174-room hotel featuring a 400-seat dining room on the ground floor, complete with a barbershop, billiard room, which is kind of pool, wrought iron verandas, and a formal garden. The hotel closed December 31st, 1964, and despite vigorous preservation advocacy, the hotel was raised in September of 71. Presently, the MARC station occupies the former space, and trains will run back and forth to Union Station in D.C. And when Cord came back from Chicago, I believe he passed through Cumberland. So you can take the train all the way out to Chicago. Frederick Douglass was a conspicuous presence on railroads for more than a half century. Having escaped slavery via rail in Baltimore in 1838, Douglass traveled throughout the New England, Midwest, and later the Mid-Atlantic and Southern states via rail. Nearby areas in which Douglass traveled via rail from D.C. and or Baltimore include Hagerstown, Cumberland, Frostburg, Martinsburg, Harpers Ferry, Wheeling, Grafton, Pittsburgh, and communities throughout Ohio. And this is just a kind of nice historic postcard of a train pulling into the Queen City Hotel. Some may know the Deer Park Inn was built in Deer Park, Maryland, which, as Bishop knows, Deer Park Water gets his namesake from Deer Park, Maryland. And John W. Garrett, who was very active in Republican Party politics and was the president of the B&O Railroad, is the namesake for Garrett County. And so the B&O Railroad was very deliberate in kind of building these grand hotels right on the rail line. I believe President Cleveland honeymooned out in Deer Park. All right. So this is kind of an interesting little insight into the staffing at the Queen City Hotel. This is from the Baltimore Afro-American, 1896. It reads, quote, "The help at the Queen City Hotel who have been on the anxious seat for some time have been relieved of the strain and uncertainty of their uncertainty. The management of the hotel has changed hands and several of the employees have resigned. Among those who remain at their posts are Fulton Harris, bartender, Beecher Bates, who is in charge of the lunch counter, Buck Freeman, head waiter, Robert Trent, day porter, and Mr. Wood, night porter. The change came like a cyclone to some." So Mr. McNeil and I have not had the time to do a real deep history dive, but we do dare speculate that one or more of these gentlemen may have worked at the Queen City Hotel in September 1879 and maybe welcomed Mr. Douglass and brought his bags from the train into his room or from his room onto the train. And some know A. Philip Randolph, one of his early labor organizing efforts was organizing Black Pullman porters. And so here are just kind of some historic images of Black porters. And so you find it very, the B&O Railroad, Douglass never faced any discrimination riding on that railroad system. He faced discrimination on other railway systems, but I believe that the B&O Railroad was very progressive in its day, where when Douglass had a first-class seat on the B&O Railroad, he knew that he would be treated with first-class accommodations. He would not be asked to move. And so the B&O Railroad was not only favorable to Black passengers, and for example, like on Emancipation Day, the B&O Railroad gave like a special kind of price ticket because of wanting to facilitate the travel of Black folks to Cumberland to attend this event, but also the B&O Railroad employed Black Americans on the railway system as well as at their hotels. All right, does anybody know where this mural is? I know at least one person here knows where it is.
Oakland.
Oakland, excellent. Okay, so this is a mural in kind of the downtown burgeoning metropolis of Oakland.
It's a nice mural too.
And you'll see that Mr. John Garrett is to the right, And I believe in the back is kind of the former Deer Park and hotel. And you'll see kind of there standing in a kind of ready to help out passengers, whether they be VIPs or just regular folks, help them with their baggage, is a black porter.
Yeah, at that time, having black porters, black barbers, people working at the Queen City Hotel, like having black folks there was purposeful in showing that, he was not discriminatory in hiring. And of course, as the B&O Railroad's a common carrier, he would have handled, workloads or public transportation for all types of people, not, denying anyone service or anything like that. This is actually a really nice mural. I like it.
And the B&O Railroad, I believe their tagline was they connected the nation to 13 states, or I may have that tagline a little wrong. Basically, the B&O Railroad ran through 13 states as well as the District of Columbia. All right, so, okay, here we go. This is what you've all patiently waited for. All right, so Cumberland prepares for the visit of U.S. Marshal Frederick Douglass. Here's an interesting little item where it says in the middle, active preparations are being made for the colored emancipation celebration to be held at the fairgrounds September 22nd. Frederick Douglass will deliver the address. And this was the Cumberland letter from the Baltimore Sun.
And this is, by the way, what I got most excited for about this presentation. Douglass coming here for the Emancipation Day celebration. And this is what John where he got me in the hook for the Cumberland presentation. And if you look at the next slide, you'll see this depiction of, I'm not sure this is Emancipation Day celebration, but you'll see like this would have been maybe the environment that we're in. You have the gentleman there who was the drum major leading the procession. And as the papers reported, the colored folks, the black people of that town that day were all dressed to the nines in their Sunday best. I really like this photo. And other photos, as John knows, they have a lot of the black kids just like barefoot running around. So yeah, this one's a little bit more tasteful.
Yeah, there's some woodcuts of Emancipation Day celebrations in D.C. where there's some young kids that don't have any shoes on. So this is, I guess in Cumberland they had shoes on, but in DC might not have had shoes on. You can see the ladies in their finery with their nice hats on and dresses, and they're kind of lifting up the dresses to make sure they don't get muddy. And so yeah, this is kind of a period woodcut.
Next.
All right. Okay, I'm sorry. Here we go. This is okay. Frederick Douglass in Cumberland. He is received by the authorities and delivers an address. Dateline September 23, 1879. Emancipation Day was yesterday celebrated in the city in a very enthusiastic manner by the colored people who flocked to the city in large numbers from the neighboring towns of Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Maryland. It was a gala day for the colored race. About 2,000 visitors were in town, and the streets presented an animated appearance. The weather was cloudy, but no rain fell, and everything went off pleasantly. About noon, a procession was formed which passed through the principal streets and winded its way to the fairgrounds, which are located in a commanding position to the east of the city. Several Masonic and other secret societies appeared in line. Marshal Douglass arrived on the express train from Washington at 2:10 p.m. He was met at the Queen City Hotel by an immense crowd of people and escorted through the principal streets in a barouche in which were seated the Mayor William J. Reed, Honorable Henry W. Hoffman, and Reverend B.H. Lee, the pastor of the African Methodist Episcopal Church in the city, who was also the president of the meeting. I haven't found that Douglass's address benefited in a financial way Metropolitan AME, but I believe that's possible due to the prominent position of the pastor. I just haven't found any documentation to confirm that. The procession arrived at the fairgrounds at 3 o'clock, escorted by a band of music. Among the vast assemblage present were Honorables George A. Peer. Now, this is the judge, and I believe his son was a future congressman from the 6th District. He represented Garrett, Allegany, Washington counties as a judge. Lloyd Lowndes, William Walsh, Mr. R.D. Johnson, who was a prominent Democrat, A. Hunter Boyd, the state's attorney of Allegany County, and a number of prominent citizens, including several ladies. The meeting was called to order by Reverend B.H. Lee, the chairman who introduced Marshal Douglass. He spoke for 2 hours in a very eloquent manner, and we hopefully will speak less than 2 hours today, but we appreciate your kind patience and attention. All right.
This next photo, that is a photo of the Western Maryland band.
That's actually a YMCA band out of Cumberland. This is a little post 1879, but it kind of when Douglass is here in Cumberland, he would have been met by several kind of brass bands, cornet bands from Cumberland as well as neighboring towns.
Yeah, I know the Western Maryland band was here when Douglass was here. So I'll just read this. Black Americans have a long history of ritualizing events associated with the liberation of Black people, both domestic and foreign. In the early 19th century, the limited few free Black communities earmarked certain days like January 1 to observe the U.S.'s ban on international trafficking to the states, which passed in 1808. And as well, July the 5th to observe the day that New York passed the Gradual Emancipation Act of 1799. In the District of Columbia, one of the earliest Emancipation Day celebrations in the country took place immediately after the end of the Civil War and the ratification of the 13th Amendment in April of 1865. That was 3 years after Lincoln had signed the Compensated Emancipation Act on April 16, 1862, immediately outlawing slavery in Old Washington City. Formal celebrations followed the year after, organized by the district's socially prominent citizens. That would follow a year after the war ended in 1866. So by no surprise, staying consistent with the traditions of those free Black communities that existed prior to the Civil War, emancipation themed events sprang about the country. Next slide. And so, leading into the 20th century, ceremonious events commemorating Lincoln's issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation on September 22nd, 1862, ending the practice of slavery in the rebellious Confederate states were numerous among the colored freedmen communities. It was nearly a century prior that free Black folks were at a cross with this nation's annual celebration of its birth. While some free Black Americans were able to use the 4th of July to assert their patriotism and validate their citizenship, not a few Black Americans had been made to feel unwelcome at some Independence Day celebrations, at times having been met with violence. So the precarity of those type of incidents originated another tradition in Black communities. And I don't know how many of you know this, but I have family members that still do this, but they still celebrate the 4th of July on the 5th. Just a little interesting note to look at Black people's lives, anyway. So the purgatorial sentiment is reinforced in Douglass's 1852 speech, "What to the slave is the 4th of July." I'm sure you all see that. They play that thing every 4th of July on YouTube. Mr. Douglass asserted that while America was celebrating its independence and freedom, millions of its fellow Americans were being denied theirs. And so it's with this in mind that Douglass understood, once that time came, the importance of creating these experiences centered on the freedmen would give an opportunity to Black Americans to express their idea of American nationalism collectively, many times being the first time. Mr. Douglass's presence on this Emancipation Day in Cumberland is a deliberate act of diplomacy, both as an ambassador for his race and an emissary for the Republican Party politics he supported. He was a frequent attendee, grand marshal, keynote speaker at emancipation-themed events, including Boston, Massachusetts, Wilmington, Delaware, Wheeling, West Virginia, and DC. As my understanding is, like, the Emancipation Day events early on were almost like that was Black America's Passover. It was like something that would have been like similar to the Hebrews, coming out of Egypt almost, right? Next slide.
All right, this is from one of the daily newspapers out of Cumberland, the Emancipation Celebration. The proceedings yesterday, the procession, speech of Honorable Frederick Douglass, he gives his brethren some advice. The Emancipation Celebration held by our colored citizens yesterday was a memorable occasion. Although the attendance from abroad was not so large as expected, there not having been over 300 strangers in the city, our own colored people turned out well to do honor to the occasion, and they were everywhere to be seen in holiday attire, bent on extracting the most enjoyment from the day. A number of residences were decked with flags and flowers, and a large flag was stretched over Frederick Street and another hang from the roof of the news office. On the arrival of the Pittsburgh special train, a procession was formed as follows. Western Maryland Band, Laboring Sons of Cumberland, 45 members. Star Club, 35 strong. Union League Club, 40 members. Frederick Douglass Club, 20 members. Carriages containing ministers, 3 wagons. There would have been also essentially veterans organizations where the veterans that are the United States Colored Troops veterans that are buried in Sumner Cemetery. Have not done my own independent research, but I would operate under a presumption that some of them were involved in the Grand Army of the Republic, and Frederick Douglass was a frequent attendee at Grand Army of the Republic celebrations and would address their meetings. And when Douglass would attend towns and be kind of parade through the streets, there would frequently be veterans groups that would accompany him. There's actually a story where he's in Georgia and the veterans do a 21-gun salute, and basically all the animals are very excited, and some of them like ran off because they weren't used to like a 21-gun salute in this small southern town. All right, continuing on. These are some of the remarks. Honorable Frederick Douglass, the order of the day, arrived at the 210 express train from Washington, was met at the depot by a large concourse of people of both races, desirous of obtaining a sight of the great orator and statesman. It is estimated that 1,000 persons, among them a number of our leading white citizens, listened to the speech. Now, also, depending on whether it's like the Democratic papers would probably minimize the attendance, or the Republican papers would kind of maybe amplify the attendance. So it kind of depends on what the source is, but it appears that Douglass was met with a very large group of folks that met him at the train station. Then when he went through the street, there was a large concourse. So some say 1,000, some say 2,000. There's one account that has more than 2,000. So it's good to say that he had a good reception. All right, Douglass says, friends and fellow citizens, I am glad to meet you today under such favorable surroundings to celebrate perhaps the most important event that has occurred since the Declaration of Independence. I will say at the outset that there was a time this assemblages would have been impossible in Cumberland. I remember when it was not thought safe for me to have appeared among the mountains of Maryland. 35 years ago, my name was mentioned in this section in whispers, and I was regarded as a dangerous Negro. But today I arrived here and nobody seems afraid of me. And as I rode in a brooch beside your honored mayor, I did feel the weight of a single brick, which I think Douglass is making that joke. But essentially Douglass is saying that his narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass in 1845 was actually legally in the state of Maryland incendiary literature. And so to speak about Frederick Douglass, you might incriminate yourself. Well, why are you speaking about him? Because you've been reading his book. And if you've been reading his book, that could be potentially a criminal offense. All right. And also Douglass, in his remarks, said to the citizens of Cumberland that he did not support the Exoduster movement, and he felt that Black folks in Cumberland should stay in Cumberland and make the most of their community, whether it be churches, businesses, schools, and essentially is addressing Cumberland as though it is like essentially a southern community and urging citizens not to move to maybe Baltimore or Washington, and to kind of stay in Cumberland, make the most of or strengthen your community. All right. This is from the Mining Journal out of Frostburg, and it just kind of repeats some of what we've already said. And it does say that Frostburg was fully represented, which leads into a couple other slides. But this is just these are members of the Frederick Douglass entourage in Cumberland. Mr. Boyd would later go on to be the Chief Justice of the Maryland Supreme Court, of the Maryland Court of Special Appeals. William Walsh, who was the Democratic congressman who had defeated Lloyd Lowndes, he was part of the assemblage. So there was an integrated, also inter-party Republicans and Democrats that welcomed Mr. Douglass. And Henry William Hoffman, who was buried here in Cumberland, I could not find a photo of him, but he was appointed as the director of the Customs House in Baltimore by President Lincoln, and that document is correspondence where I believe Hoffman is writing to Lincoln as the Unconditional Union State Central Committee of Maryland. And essentially the leaders of Maryland who helped to keep Maryland in the Union, who later went on to be Republicans, they were awarded with federal patronage positions from President Lincoln, and Mr. Hoffman was part of that entourage that welcomed Mr. Douglass. All right, so this is a little bit of a side note, but an important note nonetheless. So this is Storr College in Harpers Ferry, West Virginia. Mr. Douglass gave a very famous address in 1881 at the dedication of Anthony Hall, which is the building to your kind of bottom right. Anthony Hall stands today right off of Fillmore Street in Harpers Ferry. It is kind of an administrative building of the National Park Service. And when Douglass spoke in Harpers Ferry at Storr College, he was in all likelihood speaking to many students at Storr College from Allegany County. This is the catalog of Storr College 1879 to 1881. And you'll see underlined Mary Brown Frostburg, Florence Martin Cumberland, Charles Plummer Cumberland, and the Allegany County was well represented in Storr College's student body. The 1879-1881 Storr College catalog indicates 9 students from Allegany County attending Storr College in Harpers Ferry for minimally 1 semester within an academic year. Allegany County students shared classrooms with fellow Marylanders from areas of Frederick and Washington counties, as well as areas of Jefferson County, West Virginia, and neighboring communities of West Virginia. Both representative students from Frostburg have the surname Brown, as you'll see Mary L. Brown and James Brown, as well as 2 other students from Cumberland. It is likely these students had kinship connections to Tamar Brown, a post-emancipation property owner in Frostburg with whom the name of Brownsville is associated. It is possible Lizzie Lee is the daughter of local AME Reverend B.H. Lee, who escorted Douglass through the Queen City. And to the photo there is a student, kind of a yearbook photo of students at Storr College in the early 1880s. And it is very possible there are some Allegany County students represented in that photograph. All right. The recognition and discussion of Frederick Douglass within the communities of Western Maryland is incomplete without a recognition and discussion of students from these respective communities who attended institutions of higher learning in Washington, Baltimore, Harpers Ferry, and neighboring areas, Mr. McNeil and I would contend. Establishment of the Freedmen's Bureau schools in areas of Western Maryland and nearby West Virginia enabled the first generation of Black Americans to not only attend schools, but pursue careers in education and its growing administration at the local, county, and statewide levels. Founded as a normal school, Storr College in Harpers Ferry was initially founded to prepare students to become teachers in schools throughout the Mountain South and areas of Western Maryland. This is when you would have had kind of a white school system and a colored school system. And so there was a transition between the early colored schools had white teachers because it was most often women were kind of trained to become teachers in like New England, Connecticut, New Hampshire, Massachusetts. They would come down to the South and they would teach in these schools. And then after kind of the first generation, then you began to have Black teachers because they were trained at institutions such as Storr College. I'm going to read these last 2 paragraphs and then Mr. McNeil will share a wonderful essay with us. Some notable graduates and students with whom Douglass shared connections at Storr College were Jacob F. Wheaton, who attended Howard Law School, and John Robert Clifford, who in the fall of 1894 served as the founding principal of the ill-fated Manassas Industrial School with Douglass. This was kind of like a vocational school, like a Lincoln Tech of its time. In the 1890s, J.R. Clifford, a grand uncle to Dr. Henry Louis Gates, became the first Black American lawyer to practice law in Allegany County, where he served as a defense attorney in a criminal case. You want to go?
Yeah, I mean, I'd share a little something. As someone who matriculated at a HBCU, I do hold Storr College and its history in high esteem. But I'll say this, coming out of the Civil War, a few things were more important among the freedmen communities than education and gaining marketable skills that would benefit them in earning a living. There were already too few established institutions that permitted young Black scholars, and it wouldn't suffice to serve their needs of a growing prospective group of learners. The thing about Storr College, let me say this. Store College being the first institution established in the Cumberland Valley, Mountain South region, specifically for Black folks, for educating Black people. Served very much as a function as an incubator, right? So it would be a controlled environment suitable for the optimal growth of these young Black students. I can only presuppose, based on my own experience, that the student body enjoyed their time within Store College, in the halls of Store College, and as you know, anyone being there, teacher, staff, student, support, whatever, would have been supportive of these students in their, in their efforts to gain these marketable skills. And that's it. Nothing too much in detail.
Okay. That's all?
Yeah.
Yeah. Justin actually has like a long thing he's written here, but he's being.
But I don't want to read it because I feel like this is not as much focused on Cumberland. So I want to keep it kind of Cumberland focused.
The point about it is that when we talk about the history of HBCUs, I think somehow, some way, unfortunately, the impact of these institutions is lost on like the local communities, because although they were based in Washington, D.C. or Harpers Ferry, where are they pulling students from? And so the Black community here in Cumberland has the opportunity to send students to these institutions. And as I'll talk to you about in just a moment, that it was very deliberate, where you couldn't just show up at the doors of Store College and Howard University and be accepted. You had to have advanced education. You had to have prior education or prior training, which is a testament to the education that the Black community received here in Cumberland to prepare these students to attend these institutions.
That's a great point.
All right, and so as a transition to the next slide, so the Freedmen's Bureau schools throughout Western Maryland prepared students for college. Before Maryland allocated public funding for the establishment of a segregated public school system of white and colored schools, the Freedmen's Bureau worked with local communities, often their Methodist churches, to establish classrooms, pay for the hiring of teachers, and build independent schoolhouses. Freedmen's Bureau schools were established throughout the state, including in Western Maryland and adjacent communities in West Virginia. Most of the schools in West Virginia were focused in the Eastern Panhandle. This specific monthly report delineates a school in Cumberland, which was supported by the Baltimore Association, which was kind of a Methodist, supported by the Methodist Church. And there are 52 students enrolled. I don't know how you can see that, but it has Frederick County, which had schools in Newmarket, Liberty, Petersville. And then there's Hagerstown with Washington County with the school in Hagerstown. And then there's Cumberland, Allegany County with a school in Cumberland, which has 52 students at the time. There were, I believe, schools or a schoolhouse in Westernport, and I'm not sure if there was an independent school in Frostburg, but it is quite possible that students from Frostburg would have come down the road into Cumberland. So the 52 students that are attending the Freedmen's Bureau School in Cumberland might not have all been from Cumberland, but some of the adjacent communities. And so the students at these schools are receiving the ABCs 1, 2, 3s that then are going to prepare their enrollment and admission to a place like Howard University or Centenary Biblical Institute, which is now Morgan State University in Baltimore, or the former Store College. And these are just a couple little historic prints and images of the Freedmen's Bureau schools. All right, this slide I meant to take out of the presentation, so we'll just fast forward because this is just a reiteration. Yeah, this is a duplicate. Okay, this is another photo of the student body at Store College. This is kind of earlier on in the 1870s. All right, okay. For our Jane Gates scholars, you will see there is Virginia Gates, delineated being from Cumberland, Maryland. Was Virginia Gates, who was a student at Store College, a member of the family of Jane Gates of Green Street on the west side of Cumberland? Shortly after the Civil War, Jane Gates, who was 51 years old at the time, appears in the 1870 census as a nurse and laundress living with 2 of her children and 2 grandchildren on Green Street on Cumberland's west side. We have been unable to gather more information about Virginia Gates at the present moment. We hope to do so in the future, but we believe that Virginia Gates was in all likelihood some way related to Jane Gates, and it is quite possible that Virginia Gates, when she was home from breaks in her studies at Storer College, would have had some tea on the front porch of the historic Jane Gates house. If not, she possibly lived there. We just have been unable to develop that history, whereas it's very important to focus and uplift and elevate Jane Gates' history. But then I also think including the family portfolio is consequential, where there are members of the Gates family at Storer College generations before Henry Louis Gates attended Potomac State College and Harvard University. All right. I apologize. I mean, these slides are a little backwards. Ali, if you could forward to the next one, and then we'll go backwards. So there were Allegany County students at Howard University. Founded in 1867 as an integrated and co-ed institution of higher learning, Howard University, named for Union General Oliver Otis Howard, drew students from all over the country as well as international students. Frederick Douglass served on Howard's board from 1872 until his death in 1895. Although Allegany County students were not represented in the same concentrated numbers at Howard as they were at Storer College and Centenary Biblical Institute in Baltimore, they were present and accounted for among an expansive student body. The archival record demonstrates that Benjamin F. Stewart was active within local politics and prominent in the community affairs in Cumberland, Allegany County, in the tri-state area. I do not know that I don't believe he graduated from Howard University, but he was a student in the theological department in the school year of 1877 to 1878. And Atwood P. Latham, who was a undergraduate who graduated in 1883, was from Cumberland, Maryland. I have not been able to find information about Mr. Latham. And then, Ali, if you'd be so kind to go kind of backwards one slide. So this is Cumberland's Benjamin F. Stewart canvasses Allegany County. These news clips are after he attends Howard University, and he's a student at the Lutheran College in Pennsylvania, and he delivered a forcible address at the Opera House to the local Republicans of the local colored Republicans of the 11th and 12th District. Mr. Stewart made one of the best Republican speeches during the campaign in this section. So essentially, these were young men who were kind of following the tradition that Frederick Douglass had kind of helped. Where Frederick Douglass he was a national figure who came to local communities, and I would think that it would have had direct influence on these young men, which then they kind of took ownership or took the torch, if you will, within their local communities. To your right is a clipping from the Emancipation celebration in Cumberland. This was, I believe, 1881, and you will see that Mr. Stewart is going to give one of the keynote addresses, and there will be delegations from Cumberland, Bedford, Pennsylvania, Piedmont, Kaiser, Romney, West Virginia, and Myersdale. All right, apologize, Ali. We got to fast forward, I guess, 2 slides. All right, so Douglass also returns to Allegany County in 1882, as Denise surely knows well. All right, Frostburg. All right, so Frostburg is preparing for the visit of Frederick Douglass, and this is an interesting news clip. Now, I know our friend Sojourner Truth lives in Frostburg. I don't know if anyone else came down from Frostburg, but this is kind of an interesting commentary on Frostburg. And Frostburg at that time would have been kind of a smaller community than it is today. It didn't have the benefit of the university, so we take that into consideration. So this is an interesting item. It says, something new in the way of amusements. For some time past, there has been a growing complaint against the traveling companies of so-called dramatic artists who have visited our town, that being Frostburg. Very often their performances were below the mediocre of amateurs. Again, the female performers were in several instances decidedly questionable in character and morals. To do away with this grievance and secure for the amusements and instruction of our citizens, first-class performances, Oddfellows Opera House has been engaged for one night each month of the year for instructive and pleasing entertainment. As an opening to these rich intellectual treats, the great colored orator, Honorable Frederick Douglass of Washington, D.C., will be introduced on the 27th. The gentleman has gained a national reputation as a lecturer and public speaker. Reserved seats will be placed on sale next week. For particulars, see the posters in the paper. So that clip is to the left. To the right is the proceeding of essentially the Frostburg Town Council in March of 1882, and a petition was received from members of the AME Church asking for a street lamp in front of their house of worship on Mechanic Street, which was so granted by the Frostburg Town Council. That is the present-day Dickerson African Methodist Episcopal Church, which the cornerstones there, I believe one says like 1855. I believe that its current location is about the 1880s. So I'm not sure if that, well, when Douglass visits Cumberland, that church was there at that location and they requested a street lamp. I do believe that when Frostburg gained its own AME church, it wasn't a different location, it was a different building. I will defer to others on that. All right, so here is a 1906 map of Frostburg. To the left are two postcards, which are showing the railroad depot. And Douglass arrived in Frostburg via rail. And there's a little clip on the bottom. It says the African Methodist Episcopal Church has a festival going on in Brownsville. I believe that Douglass was encouraged and or maybe strongly encouraged by students at Storer College who were from Frostburg that said, Mr. Douglass, you've spoken Cumberland. We think that you should come and speak in our community. We have a neighborhood called Brownsville, which is made up of primarily Black folks, and you should come. Like, you know, we'd like to see you. We'd be glad to welcome you. And we'd be glad to serve your favorite Maryland beaten biscuits and Maryland fried chicken, which that's a whole nother history, which your young man here who just stepped out is a scholar of fried chicken culinary history, which Frederick Douglass's favorite meals were fried chicken and Maryland beaten biscuits. All right. So this is a little item from the newspaper announcing Frederick Douglass's lecture, which Self-Made Men is a lecture that he delivered probably more than 200 times. It was kind of like a self-help sort of speech where Douglass is encouraging individuals kind of to work hard, work diligently to save. And you just missed it, Bishop. I was just giving a quick little diatribe about Frederick Douglass's favorite food, fried chicken, which Bishop is a culinary historian of the varieties of fried chicken. All right. So this was at the. What'd you say?
About an hour, like almost an hour and a half long. The speech. I don't know if you've ever like seen it online.
The Self-Made Men, yeah. If you go on Google, there are some Douglass reenactors who read basically the speech in its entirety, which would run about an hour and a half long. Douglass would vary it depending on the community that he would address, but he essentially said that there are no self-made men that haven't like lied, cheated, stealed, and have had basically benefit and fortune. And
well, also he was saying that there's no self-made men that also had like an easy come up either. So it'd be like, you know, I think he said somewhere it's like if you want to know like where the hard men are made, like you got to go up to the Northeast where it's like cold 6 months out of the year, and you know, basically saying like, you know, in order there's a variety of men. I think he says there's genius men, there's, you know, good men, but at the heart of it, you're all got to be men first. And like part of being men is being able to build yourselves up, and you know, through hard work. Like Douglass was no stranger to hard work.
Yes, Douglass was described in contemporary newspaper reports as being very manly. And so he kind of promoted, not to say he promoted a toxic masculinity, but he did basically say, he would say some speeches, actually, even on the Eastern Shore, he says to all the folks in Baltimore hanging on the street corners with like wet cigars from their mouth, like throw down the cigars and like pick up a brick and like start working. I mean, Douglass was basically someone who encouraged people to take ownership of their own destinies and supported those who had a real hard self-determination and spirit. And so Douglass's Self-Made Men was kind of this generic general speech that Douglass would offer as kind of an inspiration to those who were in attendance to hear it.
Yeah, today might be a speech that he might make at like, some inner city high school or something. But it's a good speech.
All right. And these gentlemen, the Hitchens brothers, Hitchens Brothers Company, composed of Adam and Owen, was featured in a publication celebrating the centennial history of Frostburg. They were members of the local Oddfellows Hall, which was kind of like the Lions Club of its day, where the Oddfellows would support orphanages and public hospitals and kind of do goodwill and make sure kids had backpacks when they went back to school and Christmas presents. And the tickets for the lecture of Frederick Douglass, the lecture that Douglass delivered in Frostburg, were sold at the Hitchens Brothers store, which is featured thusly. And we have the benefit from the collection of Mr. Al Feldstein, the old Opera House in Frostburg. I believe that this, at some time in the early 1900s, burned. I don't know the exact history, but that building is no longer extant. But we can see it's a several-story building. And it kind of resembles Brewer's Alley in Frederick, which is where Douglass spoke. And that at one time was the City Hall and then the Opera House. And as I understand, the Opera House was kind of the upper floor. And you can see kind of the streetcar running right alongside a horse-drawn carriage. And this is kind of just another little interesting insight into Frostburg at the time. Now, Douglass spoke in March of 1882. So it might have been a little cold, a little blustery, a little windy. So maybe this is before North Face jackets and other things. So maybe, I guess they probably have bearskin coats. But anyway, it could have been a very cold night. So I don't know what, if there were anything prohibiting people from attending. But nonetheless, this is what the Frostburg Mining Journal reported. Honorable Frederick Douglass of Washington, D.C. lectured in the Oddfellows Opera House Thursday evening to a small but intelligent audience. The lecture was one of the best ever delivered in this town and abounded in beautiful pictures, pleasing to the ear, and the speaker at times became eloquent. It is safe to say that lectures are not a financial success in Frostburg. All right. So, but I will say, because he gave the speech in March, maybe there were other outstanding circumstances and factors. All right, I will just add this little bit of a plug that Mr. McNeil and I do believe, or would argue, that maybe there should be a historic marker or signage at the former home of Governor Lloyd Lowndes that maybe could discuss his relationship, his friendship with Frederick Douglass. This is the current marker on Washington Street on the site of the former home of Governor Lloyd Lowndes. And the site, as I'm sure many of you know, is next door to the library and across the street from the Allegany Courthouse. And this was placed in 1976, which, for those of you who lived through 1976 or kind of studied a lot of historic records, you see a real enthusiasm for local history around the bicentennial. So a lot of historic markers are placed in 1976, like in Washington, D.C. The boundary stones got a lot of attention in the 70s. And then some of that enthusiasm just kind of fades out a little bit. So I think Lloyd Lowndes is a really interesting, consequential historical figure. And from what I can tell, had a very warm relationship or warm friendship with Frederick Douglass. And I think that Cumberland should be on the promotional materials, that the state of Maryland, that everyone here buys a pack of gum, pays taxes to support the Maryland Office of Tourism, that Frederick Douglass in Western Maryland history has really not been promoted or advocated for within some of these state-produced materials. So I think that one of the great potential starting points is to develop some information about the relationship of Governor Lowndes and Mr. Douglass. All right. So this is just to reiterate some of the thank yous, and you'll see Bishop and Bronson McNeil, young Douglassonians, are featured there in the Fells Point neighborhood. And we would just like to reiterate our thanks to all of those who braved the windy, snowy weather to make it here today. And we'd like to thank Sojourner Truth for her constant, steady, perfect attendance at all of these lectures and presentations Mr. McNeil and I delivered. We actually spoke at Potomac State College in December, and Sherry was there. And so that concludes our presentation, and we did wrap it in under 2 hours, but it was a long hour and a half. So if anyone has any comments, questions, critiques, we'd be glad to take them. And I don't know, Ali, if there's any comments online, we'd be glad to try to answer anyone's comments.
There were 2 questions that came in online. One was, what is the significance of the name of Queen City?
Oh, well, I did try to answer that a little bit. So Cumberland.
Okay. I just see that now.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Okay. Well, Cumberland's the second largest city, was the second largest city in Maryland at one point. And so it would have been the second major porting hub after Baltimore. So in essence, it's the queen to its Baltimore's king.
The second question was, Douglass paid a reasonable and respectable salary for his speeches. Were his speeches his only form of income?
That's a wonderful question. So Douglass was involved in a Lyceum Speakers Bureau that Mark Twain and other prominent speakers were involved in. So you have, like in DC today, the Washington Speakers Bureau is where you'll get business people, politicians, if you like a keynote speaker. Douglass was essentially a member of that equivalent in his time. He would receive $100 for each speech. He would negotiate his travel to and from the site. And so that was a lucrative endeavor, although Douglass did sometimes tire a little bit of traveling and speaking everywhere. But Douglass had a diversified stream of income. Following the Civil War, Douglass was active in real estate in both Rochester and Washington, D.C. He had rental properties. He was an investor in the Anacostia River Railway Company, which was a streetcar in its day. This is before like Metro or MTA. And when Douglass passed away, he still had stock in that streetcar company. He was a member of the Alpha Savings and Trust Bank in Washington, D.C. Also significantly is he received essentially federal patronage positions. So he was appointed Marshal by Rutherford B. Hayes. He was appointed Recorder of Deeds of Washington by President Garfield. He actually served the administration of Garfield Arthur a year and a half into Grover Cleveland. He then was ambassador to Haiti. So Douglass had patronage positions, real estate income, investing in kind of almost infrastructure. He had municipal bonds and stocks. And so Douglass was someone who, I don't know that he bet on horse races, but I do know that he also attended horse races. And so he was someone who knew the value of a dollar, but also knew the value of making an extra dollar.
Yeah, and I don't think he would have tried to been compensated for his appearance here in Cumberland. I think that was him speaking directly to the benefit of the local community. Oftentimes, like in Frederick, he speaks there, and the church is able to raise money behind his appearance to, allocate the funds to the, what we call the Black church, like the building fund or whatever, for them to build, to build or make improvements as necessary for the church.
Yeah, when Douglass has his government positions, he more before the Civil War, he's speaking as a member of the Anti-Slavery Society and kind of other organizations where he's receiving essentially an honorarium. Then some of the honorarium is going to support the organization. Following the Civil War, he gives speeches for a fee, but he also gives frequently benefit lectures for orphanages, for churches, for schools, and like the Emancipation Day parade event. I believe that, well, this is a little bit of my speculation, that possibly the Black community would have kind of sponsored his travel here, but then essentially his appearance would have been on a pro bono basis, and he frequently would. He would also, later on in life, he would say that frequently that he was a little bit more circumspect later in life or people who had offered to pay for his travel and speaking fees, because he said frequently there would be like dirty, rotten scoundrels that would like make off with the like the tip jar and other things like that. And but Douglass would give lectures on several occasions where the proceeds would go to benefit that local community. So it wasn't always for his own wallet. That's kind of a long answer, but
yeah.
All right. I see we have some in-house questions. We'll go with Mr. Jordan Truth first.
Where did you, and you may have said it and I missed it, but where was the Freedmen's School, the one in Cumberland? Where was that located?
That is a wonderful question. I do not know right off the top of my head. I believe reviewing, there's the Freedmen's Bureau documents have been digitized by, I believe, the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, and I believe some other organizations are actually, I think, probably the National Archives. And I want to say that the Freedmen's Bureau School was on Frederick Street. I do not know where on Frederick Street, but I believe Frederick Street has historically been like a black community or kind of a black area of Cumberland. And absent, court records for like the purchase of a lot and also other kind of receipts from the Freedmen's Bureau records would be able to determine where exactly that school is. But I believe it was on Frederick Street. Don't actually know where. And quite often, the Freedmen's Bureau schools would initially be run out of the churches. They'd be run out of like the church basement, and then the leaders of those schools would write to the Freedmen's Bureau in Washington and say that we have 60 pupils here, we're running out of space, we don't have enough desks or chalkboards, and if you could help us with either direct funds and or basically send us lumber, that we can help basically build a school. And frequently those schools would then be built on lots that were either on the church property or essentially adjacent lots. Sometimes you would have black property owners that would either lease and or sell the property for like 1 penny or $1 to the Freedmen's Bureau to operate these schools. And so the answer to that is also that sometimes the location would move, or the location would change. And essentially they would go like wherever the teacher was able to hold school, that's where kind of the school would be. And the Freedmen's Bureau runs formally from 1865 to 1872. And then beginning, at least in the state of Maryland in 1872, the state of Maryland publicly funds schools. And then so you would have the white schools and the colored schools. And frequently like the quote unquote colored schools would be, the Freedmen's Bureau schools would transition right into that local colored school. And for example, I know like in Montgomery County, right there on Brookville and Zion Road, that was a church schoolhouse that then the church basically gave the property to the county to run the school. Because that way it kind of it would be less prohibitive for the county to open a colored school if we said, we'll give you this building. We'll give you this building. You don't have to wait and appropriate money to build a schoolhouse.
Was the Sumner Cemetery named after the congressperson who was attacked by somebody from South Carolina?
Correct.
Yes.
Yeah, he was an abolitionist and some Southerner from South Carolina. Why doesn't that surprise me? But he practically beat him to death.
Yeah, I think he beat him within an inch of his life with the cane.
Yeah. So this attack on the Capitol, this stuff is historic. I mean, it's going on for years. This kind of brutal behavior. And also, do you think? I mean, I see the Republican Party. I'm thinking, oh my God, what has happened to them? And I know, with the South was, Democrat, and they were racist, and then all of a sudden everything's changed. Do you think they have any hope for ever changing?
I'll just say one historic note to our friends watching on YouTube. Our dear friend here in the Navy hat was alluding to Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner. I don't know all of the details, but Sumner had made a disparaging remark about, I believe, another senator, another congressman, and then Preston Brooks, who was a Southerner from South Carolina, was defending the honor of his family, because I believe Sumner, the perceived insult or the direct insult was to Preston Brooks's like family or like his first cousin or second cousin who was serving in Congress. And so Preston Brooks assaulted Charles Sumner inside the U.S. Capitol. I don't know where the sergeant at arms was. Maybe they were like on their lunch break or something. I don't know. But basically, President Brooks physically beat Charles Sumner almost to death. Sumner, it was, I believe his recovery was several months. And this was before the Civil War, and was kind of foreshadowing some of the divisions that would lead up, political divisions that would lead up to the Civil War in terms of the pro-slavery Southerners and the anti-slavery radical abolitionists like Sumner and Benjamin Franklin Wade and some of these other fellows. And the Southerners responded by sending Mr. Brooks new canes, which I believe in Ken Burns' Civil War, he kind of has a little bit of an anecdote, like in the episode leading up to the Civil War, he talks about that. And in terms of the political parties, I really don't want to say anything to get in any sort of trouble or get fined, but I will say that the orientation of the political parties during Frederick Douglass's era, it's a little difficult to draw comparisons to today. Whereas the Republican Party is essentially founded in 1856. It is an anti-slavery party. President Lincoln was a Republican. And so Douglass was very, very loyal to the Republican Party. Whereas there were in the 1880s growing discontent among Black voters that essentially said we are loyal Republican voters and we are not receiving patronage positions, and we're not receiving benefits for our loyal voting. There was a slide I was going to share that I didn't want to get in any trouble, but there was a slide. There's actually in the early 1880s, there are Black voters in Cumberland that are critiquing the local government for essentially saying that if you look at all the public works positions and government positions, we're not really represented in the ranks. So whereas Douglass was a very, very loyal Republican, there were Black voters that expressed political independence in his time and in his era. And then so today, that the way that the parties are kind of viewed overall has been a little bit kind of reversed. But that's all I'll say, just because I don't want to get in any trouble. I don't want to get in any trouble. I don't know the political orientation of Mayor Morris here in Cumberland, but I do know that most of the political representation here in Western Maryland is Republican, and I believe that Western Maryland, since essentially the Civil War, has been like Republican or more like union or unionist. Yeah, I was saying I think Douglass would add some interesting comments about the idea of Western Maryland becoming part of West Virginia. But I think you had an interesting comments on that. But yeah, Douglass was a very, very loyal Republican. Where, for example, like today, I think that if you had in Douglass's day, if you had had the cable news networks and stuff, Douglass probably would have been the gentleman you would have seen like on whatever CNN or Fox News or MSNBC, wherever. He would have been that person who was basically, no matter what was going on, he would be an advocate for like the Republican Party. And there were others like who would have been advocates for the Democratic Party. And Douglass did.
You think Douglass is going on Tucker?
I think Douglass would have accepted the invitation to speak and whoever invited him to speak. And then on that platform, he probably would have advocated for the Republican Party. And it was also in terms of Douglass's like patronage, is that he was a go-between between essentially like the Postmaster General Cresswell, who was President Grant's postmaster. John Cresswell was from Cecil County, and Douglass worked closely with Postmaster General to essentially integrate the United States Post Office, where Cresswell would say to Douglass, okay, I'm setting aside X amount of positions for Black postal clerks. I'm going to you because I'd like to fill half of these with some of your recommendations. So Douglass was in that way, he was a part of the, I'm not going to say machine because I was warned against that. Yeah, the establishment. Douglass was definitely part of the Republican Party establishment where like he was an insider. He would attend Republican national conventions, So in hindsight, he wasn't really politically independent.
Well, yeah, and I have to disagree with you on Douglas maybe stumping for the GOP today. Just in that Douglas has often said that he was an independent, but he was an independent within the Republican Party, right? So I think today he may have issue with the Republican Party, but that doesn't mean that he would necessarily stump for the Democrats either. I think Douglas would show you what true, agency looks like, and yeah, he would kind of, maybe today he might speak to the nature of like captured electorates within the Democratic Party. I'm not naming any specific groups, but there is one in particular.
Might have been comfortable with what is it, Steele? Michael Steele.
Michael Steele.
Yeah.
Michael Steele's.
I don't know.
Michael Steele.
I mean, he doesn't seem-
Michael Steele's interesting. Mike
I'm not
Tyson.
saying-
Mike Tyson was his
His
brother-in-law.
brother-in-law for a while. Yeah.
Oh,
I'm not
was
gonna
he?
say
Yeah, I didn't
insulting
know
or
that.
anything, but Michael Steele's.
I think Michael Steele. He announced he was going to run for governor, and then I think he just announced that he's not going to run.
There's no
Yeah.
chance.
But I thought
I don't think anyone takes him seriously.
he seems more moderate when he's talking. I don't know if he really is that way, but
Krukov runs with Steele.
Is he?
Yes, Sojourner Truth in the back.
Is there another question? Because I already had one, so I want to.
Dr.
I
Crosby.
do have one if everybody else has had the chance.
Dr. Crosby, I saw you raise your hand and put it back down. We're glad to take your question.
Well, when I first got to Frostburg many years ago, Harper's Chicken was wonderful. And there are still Harper's around Frostburg. I have a good friend who pastors at the AME church in Frostburg.
Oh, wonderful.
And I drive past it most days when I'm running around Frostburg.
Yeah, my understanding is there was a John Wesley church that has lost to time. I'm not sure if that was an AME church or a Methodist Episcopal church, but
Yeah,
I mean, a lot. This research is still very much in its infancy, and we really appreciate the hospitality of the Allegany County Public Library for having this platform and for everyone who's gathered here online and in person. And so the history of Douglas is very, very expansive, and the way that Justin and I try to approach it is getting into like the local community and kind of trying to understand some of the context, which it takes a lot of time and walking around and canvassing. And so, yeah, I don't know, Sherry, do you have another comment or question?
Just, and very brief, because I know people have been sitting here a long time. You mentioned many prominent men that Douglas would come and speak with, be invited. Were there prominent women other than the wives of the prominent men? Were there any women church leaders or people interested in suffrage? Does anybody stand out locally as being a woman, either a woman of color or as a friend of Douglas?
Yes. Just to speculate a little bit, I do not know Jane Gates's whereabouts when Douglas spoke in Cumberland, but it is highly likely that she may have attended and or heard the music in the streets and said, oh, well, what's going on? And went down and maybe saw Mr. Douglas. We just don't have a record of that. I know that Sherry is involved in a project dealing with local suffragists. I don't know that much about Douglas and Maryland-based suffragists, but Douglas was very active in the suffragist movement. The Women's National Council would meet in Washington almost every year from about 1870 to the early 1900s. Douglas would frequently address the Women's National Council annual meetings. Actually, when Douglas dies February 20, 1895, earlier in that day, he was addressing the Women's National Council, which I just think off the top of my head that if there were members from Maryland on this national council, to see what their connections may have been to Douglas. And Sherry, as you alluded to, often the women involved in these organizations were the wives of like politicians, or that they had that sort of network. Douglas was friendly and had like connections and associations with many radical lady journalists, including Emily Edson. These are the white lady journalists: Emily Edson Briggs, Grace Greenwood, Kate Fields, Mary Clemmer Ames. Douglass, some may know, mentored Ida B. Wells, who was a pioneering Black journalist in the 1880s, early 1890s. She actually lived well into the 1900s. And so I don't have, Sharon, I know we've kind of talked about this before. I don't know what Douglass's relationship or connection may have been with, I believe Elizabeth Tasker Lowndes is believed to be kind of a pioneering suffragist in Allegany County. I do not know kind of the connections that Douglass may or may not have had. But Douglass was very much like a womanist in his time, where he supported women in the arts, women in business, women in education, and so yes. I don't know, that's kind of another long answer. Bishop or Bronson, I don't know if you guys have any questions or comments. Yes.
Couple of questions. Have you run across any evidence that Douglass ever stopped in what is now Garrett County?
Well, interesting. I had tried to find anything that could confirm that Douglass passed through Oakland or stopped in Oakland, where in 1884, Douglass spoke in Grafton, West Virginia, whereas Douglass was actually waiting to take the train from Grafton to Cincinnati. And the word like amongst the community was that Frederick Douglass is here. And so people, like, I guess, went to like the train station or train depot and started cheering Douglass, Douglass. And so Douglass came out and addressed the crowd. And he was actually introduced by, I want to say DuPont. I don't think that's right. Pierpont. The guy was like the first, the war governor of Virginia. He's credited as being like one of the first founders of West Virginia. And so if Douglass is taking the B&O Railroad from Washington, D.C. to Wheeling, West Virginia, which Douglass took the train to Wheeling in September of 1884 to address an Emancipation Day event. I believe he would have passed through Oakland. I just don't know that, if the train stops in Oakland and they're there for 10 minutes, would he have gotten off and walked around? Would the train have just been an express train where it went through the Oakland station? Believe there was the AME Church in Oakland was founded, I want to say the late 1890s, but I think it was more like 1901, 1902, 1909, the early 1900s. I believe it was active until like the early 1920s. I cannot think of the gentleman's name who was identified as being the pastor there, but I believe he was from Baltimore. But yeah, I've tried to find that, but I think that it might have been too small of a community for Douglass maybe like to address or to visit. And my understanding is that the Black population of Garrett County would essentially swell during the summertime when it was like the vacation season at the Deer Park Inn or Mountain Lake Park, and that yeah, I don't have anything on that, but I'd be really, really interested to find maybe like some sort of document or diary or something that says like, I was waiting for the train at Oakland and I saw, this fellow with white, fluffy hair, and I shook his hand and he signed my paper. And then years later, I looked at my school book and it said Frederick Douglass or something like that. But I believe that he would have had to, the train route, I believe, went through Oakland if you were going from Baltimore to Cumberland to Wheeling. I'm pretty sure that some railroad historians in here may know better than I, but so to say that Douglass passed through Garrett County is very, very likely. That he got out and walked around Oakland, I do not know. For example, when Douglass is in Cecil County in late 1885, he takes the train from Baltimore to Rising Sun in Cecil County, and he got off in Port Deposit and walked around for like 2 hours, and the newspaper reported that it said like there's great excitement amongst the Black community in Port Deposit because Frederick Douglass walked around for 2 hours. Like, shook hands and kissed babies and signed people's like school books or something. So that's a long answer. but the answer is not yet.
Okay.
And it's another thing that's kind of more probably will remain like an open-ended question. And I believe there are 2 U.S. colored troops that are buried, and I want to say is it Oakland Cemetery or Oakland Municipal Cemetery? Because the church was on 5th and
Right next to the cemetery, literally across the corner.
Yeah, they had a big ceremony, didn't they?
Mhm.
For them, yeah.
For what it's worth, I don't know how it was then, but Garrett County is part of the West Virginia Methodist organization. So if you go looking for Methodist records, you won't find them in Baltimore
interesting.
for at least modern Garrett County. I'm not sure how far that goes back. They're in the West Virginia archives.
Interesting. That I did not know that. I in the West, well, in Virginia or West Virginia, as I understand, the Baptist, in terms of black churches, before the Civil War, there were black Baptist churches in Virginia. Lincoln actually met with a delegation of black Baptist preachers from Virginia at the White House in like 62. And that then following the Civil War, the Methodist Church was able to expand basically into West Virginia, formerly Virginia, because Wayman talks about traveling to like Parkersburg, Wheeling, and other areas. And so, yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I just, I'm not very studied up on this issue, and some of it is very difficult to track down. As you alluded to, like I may think that you could find information about Oakland in Baltimore, but you're more likely going to find it linked in with like Shepherdstown and churches in like West Virginia.
My last question, do you have any of this in like on a website, or are you thinking of publishing it like you have your other book? The local stuff. I work at the local community college, and
Okay.
we have a history room, and we like to collect all kinds of history and everybody's history. And this is something that we don't have anything about. Nobody's written it down yet.
Well, you leave it to John. We're actively working on many histories, compendiums to other stories, and we have a lot of things in the works still. So that may be something that we try to flush out. I was just telling John earlier today that there was an interesting story and narrative here that God, who knows where it could go. I mean, just the kind of political the insider political knowledge of things going on around the Cumberland Mountain South region during this time is fascinating. So it'd be something that I'd be interested in endeavoring to do.
Yeah, we have a lot of historical irons in the fire, and I think, I mean, one of the things that Justin can probably speak about this much better than I can is when we travel around to different communities and kind of do our own little historic investigation, we find that the way maybe history is communicated through markers and trail systems leaves a lot to be determined, and it's not necessarily just like Frederick Douglass. It's just kind of overall. I mean, like the fact that George Washington was very closely affiliated with Old Town, Kieran Cumberland as like a fan, if you will, or a fanboy of George Washington. I think that would be a great like George Washington National Trail System, but there really isn't one. There's kind of more like localized. There's some markers in Berkeley Springs. There's some markers in Allegany County, but like essentially it's dependent upon someone independently piece these things together. So with Douglass is affiliated with Baltimore, D.C., the Eastern Shore, but then he had these relationships in Western Maryland, spoke in Western Maryland, and I think that a publication or something that you can kind of hold in your hand is a little more substantial than kind of these presentations, which kind of can be here one day, gone the next. And we would hope that cultural tourism is like a component of economic development now, and part of the way that these places are are marketed like as destinations. I think that it could be really cool where come follow the path of Frederick Douglass in Western Maryland and go to was it Krabby Pig Go down to the canal place and get a sandwich and maybe follow Douglas on the Sino Canal, something like that. So with all that said, we try not to get in too much trouble because we do think that it shouldn't be. It is sometimes very difficult and hard just to raise the awareness, and then a lot of it also there's a lot of political things to it. There's a lot of organizations that overlap, and it's kind of hard a little bit to get in there and say, yeah, we know, Frederick Douglass has a statue in Annapolis. There's a statue all over the place, but he has this consequential history where he spoke in the courthouse in Washington County. He walked Frederick Street, and but we appreciate the advocacy of individuals such as you that kind of see the value of this local history, because then it opens the window into then uplifting also the history of Lloyd Lowndes, which is, I think, very fascinating, especially considering Lloyd Lowndes' family is more, the Lloyd family is more historically associated with the Confederacy and or the Washington Post did a thing about slaveholding congressmen. But then you hear Lloyd Lowndes, who's part of this family, who takes a different approach where he's more pro-Black American rights, or friends with Frederick Douglass. So yes. Are you a history teacher? Are you a librarian?
I'm a librarian.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, great.
And we have folks who wander in off the streets and say, I heard Frederick Douglass was in Cumberland. What can you tell me? And I'm like, well, I heard this lecture by these two guys. And that's all I can tell you.
Shout out to the librarians.
Yeah, shout out to all librarians, and please get your library card from the Allegany County Public Library if you don't already have one, and please share this video on Facebook or Twitter. And we'd like to once again thank Ms. Allie Klein of the library. We thank our distinguished guests here today, and it's been a long presentation. We're almost coming up on 2 hours.
Doug, are your slides on your web? Are the slides available anywhere on your website?
Well, we kind of try to keep the information a little bit proprietary.
Got it.
Yeah.
But for Sherry, I'd be glad to share this with you because you are Sojourner Truth, so we go back almost hundreds of years.
Yeah.
But I mean, even the people in this room, there's got to be something we could do to, start some type of letter campaign or something to get a resolution by the state to create a Frederick Douglass, heritage trail that incorporates all of these figures like the Lewis McComas and Lloyd Lowndes and all that stuff.
And the interesting thing, a Douglass heritage trail would be a bipartisan effort, and you're kind of connecting these different regions in Maryland, where you're connecting all these different regions under the thread that it's Maryland state history.
That's a great point. It'd be a bipartisan effort.
But you have to look. He traveled everywhere. I mean, everywhere. He went to Pittsburgh. There's a lot of Blacks in Pittsburgh. I grew up in Pittsburgh area. Philadelphia. I think we need to cross the boundaries. I mean, focus on Maryland, but he was going through here a lot.
Exactly. Yeah, you can start in Maryland, and then you can branch out from other places. Like you have the Lafayette Trail that the guy I can't remember his name. Julian. This gentleman who has started the Lafayette Trail in help me out here, Hoss.
There's a gentleman who is working
With the state.
Essentially, he's working with, I believe, the French embassy or the French cultural attaché. His name is Julian Archer. You can follow the Lafayette Trail on Twitter. And Marquis de Lafayette visited the United States in 1824, 1825. So this gentleman is going throughout the country and helping to erect historic markers denoting Lafayette's visit to communities. And so therefore, in 2024, 2025, the bicentennial of Lafayette's visits, he's essentially established that infrastructure so people can then go around and visit these different places.
Yeah, he went out the National Highway because that was the first road in the United States. I mean, Lafayette visited there, so I mean, and we've got French and Indian War. We got, I mean, there's lots of connections,
I believe, I don't know all of the documentation, but I believe it's believed that Lafayette stayed in a hotel in Flintstone. Some may know more about that. I know he stayed in a hotel in Lisbon. And Frederick Douglass connection. Frederick Douglass visited Lafayette's grave in Paris.
Yeah.
Lafayette actually talked to George Washington about abolition.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, he did, because I didn't have it.
I think I can't remember the words exactly, but I think he said when Lafayette was here, he was like something to the effect of, America's great, but how they treat their Negroes is
Yeah,
not too
the
good.
French are, pretty progressive.
Yeah.
Well, we're gonna give you guys a round of applause. Thank you for sticking around. We always.
Jefferson went to Paris. His slaves went with him, some of them. One was raised as a cook or something. I think he stayed.
He took his name